So how is if you can do sort of a big sweeping progress of JavaScript, how has JavaScript changed over the years in your view from those early 10 days with a quick addition of garbage collection and fixes around security? How has this evolution that now it's taken over the world?
In this, it's been a bumpy ride because the standards body got shut down after Microsoft, I think, took over the web and then felt punished by the US v. Microsoft antitrust case.
Can you speak to the standard body? Like
that was a fun ride too, because Netscape had taken the lead with the web and HTML innovations like frames and frame sets, tables. And the W3C was sort of off even then, sort of in SGML land, heading toward XML la la land. I'm going to be a little harsh on it.
What's HTML? I'm sorry.
HTML was the precursor markup language to HTML. It was sort of the more extensible standard generalized markup language. It was a
XML like
pointy brackets, but it had all sorts of elaborate syntax for doing different semantics. And this is why I think TBL and others who wanted to do the semantic web then took XML forward. But they had this, or some of them anyway, had this strange idea they could replace the web with XML, or that they would upgrade the web to be XML. And it couldn't be done. Worse is better had concrete meaning. The web was very forgiving of HTML, including sort of minor syntax errors that could be error corrected. Like error correction isn't generally done in programming languages because
that's another amazing thing about HTML is like it's more like biology than programming.
Yeah, exactly. and so XML was in its standard form super strict and could never have admitted, the kind of users who were committing these errors. And the funniest part was Microsoft said, "Hey, we're doing XML," but the way they put it in Internet Explorer under the default media type put it through the HTML error corrector.
Oh, wow.
So they kind of bastardized it to make it popular and usable and accessible. And so XML as a pure, thing was never going to take over. And the W3C was kind of not fully functional because Netscape wasn't cooperating with them. We thought about where to take JavaScript, and we realized, our standards guru, Carl Cargill, realized there was a European standards body that had already given Microsoft fits by standardizing parts of the Windows 3.1 API, which European governments insisted on. They said, Microsoft, we can't use your operating system without some standards. And Microsoft said, here's our docs. And the government said, no, we need a European standard. So this body called the European Computer Manufacturers Association, ECMA, which eventually became global and became a proper noun instead of an acronym.
Right. It's just one capital E now with a lowercase CMA.
Right. And as one of the early Microsoft guys I met when we first convened a working group to talk about JavaScript said, it sounds like a skin disease.
But it gave, maybe you'll speak to that, but it gave the name to JavaScript of ECMAScript.
That was the standard name because Java was a trademark of Sun's. They were so aggressive, they were sending cease and desist letters to people whose Middle European heritage meant their surname was Javanko, and they called their website javanko.com, and Sun would send them a letter saying, "You're using JAVA at the start of your domain name. You must cease and desist."
I love marketing more than anything else in this world. So ECMAScript, and now is popularly named as ES plus version.
I would say people use JS more than anything. People still say JavaScript. JavaScript is in all the books.
So I mean, when you're referring to, it's usually JavaScript, and when you want to refer to a version of JavaScript, you'll say ES6, ES5.
Yes, or now they've gone to years, which is kind of confusing because it's an offset of 2009. ES6 is ES 2016.
Yeah, it doesn't match the years perfectly.
Year,
yeah. So what were the choices made, and how did JavaScript evolve here?
So we took this new standards body, which we thought sort of a proven record of standing up to Microsoft. But Microsoft sent a lot of people. They sent some people who were pretty good, and then when they realized that I was there and Netscape was not going to, just bend over and do whatever they wanted, they sent somebody really good. And he was a smart guy. He did a lot of the work on the first draft of the spec. Sean Katzenberger, he's left Microsoft. He even did what I sort of did. He told his bosses, stop bugging me to do other things. I'm focused on this, because it took a lot of focused work to create the first draft of the spec. And I was spinning almost all the plates. I had like part-time help in certain areas, and on the front end integrations, I had the front end guys. But I couldn't take as much time as Sean was to write the draft spec, but I had to participate because I was essentially helping write down what the language did. And in areas where we didn't like what it did and Microsoft didn't agree, we sometimes got away with slight changes. And that's the story of standards. You have different implementations, and depending on their market power, they interoperate where you have agreement, and where they don't, the dominant one usually sets the de facto standard. And then you should probably reflect that into the de jure standard. And this happened with JavaScript. Over time, as Netscape went down and Microsoft went up, we did the first edition of the standard, codified in 1997 in France. We had a trip to Nice, which was very memorable.
For any interesting reason, or just because it's Nice?
And ECMA's European, and IBM and others were, there. Mike Cowlishaw, an IBM fellow, was a Britisher, and the guy who ran ECMA at the time, Jan van den Belt, was quite a raconteur and a very fun guy, and he had us out for the great fruits de mer, the bouillabaisse, and
was the standardization process beautiful or painful? That those early days, you as the designer of the language?
It was painful because it was rushed. Now, Guy Steele was contributed by Sun, so even more than Sean, you had this giant brain, Guy Steele, helping bringing some of that scheme magic. And he even brought Richard Gabriel for fun. And Richard wrote the fourth clause of the ECMA standard, which is kind of an intro to what JavaScript's all about. So we had some really good people, and we didn't fight too much. There was some tension where I was fixing bugs and I was late to a meeting, and Sean Katzenberger of Microsoft was actually mad. Like, where is he? We need him. And when I got there, I saw that only he saw this sort of off by one bug somewhere in the spec. And then I saw it too. And I said, there's a fence post bug there. And then we kind of locked eyes and we realized we were on the same page, and he wasn't mad anymore.
What were the features that are being struggled over and debated and thought about? And
it was mainly writing down what worked and what we thought should work in the edge cases that didn't interoperate or that seemed wrong. But we were already laying the groundwork for the future editions that I was already implementing. I was still trying to lead the standard by using the dominant market power to write the code that actually shipped. So the de facto standard would lead the de jure standard, and I was putting in the missing function forms that I didn't have time for in the 10 days.
So this is the engineering mindset versus the theoretician. So you didn't want to create the perfect language, but one that was the popular and shipped and all that kind of stuff.
And you could say I was standing on the shoulders of giants. So there was a staged process where I had to hold back things that were well designed by others in other languages, and I could imitate, but I couldn't do them all in the 10 days. So they came in 1996 and 97, and they came into the third edition of the standard, which was finalized in 1999. But at that point, Netscape had been sold to AOL, which was a decent exit considering, and had previously been mercilessly crushed. Netscape was selling the browser along with server software that it had acquired after its IPO, and Microsoft was just underpricing it. So there was no way to compete with that. Microsoft was also, making Internet Explorer the default browser in Windows, which is called tying in antitrust law. And they were doing even more brutal things. There's a famous investor. He did very well on Google, so he's a billionaire, Ram Shriram, and he was sales guy or head of sales at Netscape. And he got off the phone looking ashen-faced after Compaq called and said, Microsoft just told us they're going to pull our Windows license if we ship Netscape as the default browser.
Wow. So there's some bullying going on.
It was totally immaterial in the antitrust case. But JavaScript escaped into the standard setting where there was fairly good cooperation. Microsoft had a really good guy on it, and Guy Steele was there for a time, and there was some good work. But after the antitrust case and Netscape kind of dissolving into AOL and not really going anywhere quickly, Mozilla took years to really bring up. The standard froze. And by 2003, even though they've been sort of noodling around with advanced versions, JavaScript 2, I'd given the keys to the kingdom to another MIT grad, Baltimore Horwath. Very big brain. Still at Google, I think. He won the Putnam in 86. So he's, very mathematical.
Legit.
He designed this successor language, JavaScript 2, but it only showed up in mutated form in Microsoft's ASP.NET server side, and it didn't last there. And it showed up in Flash, and that's what became ActionScript 3.
With ActionScript. Yeah. Interesting. And then Flash, of course, declined. And so how did we arrive at ES6, where it's like there's so many, where everyone, there's this history of JavaScript that it was just like cool when you're like having beers to talk crap about JavaScript. Everyone loves to hate, like people who are married say, marriage sucks, is they just want to let off some steam, even though everyone uses the language.
Yeah.
But ES6, it's become this like reputable, like it fixed major pain points, I think.
It added things to the language and added something that was already in ES5 strict mode, but made it implicit in class bodies and module bodies. It was a big jump, but it accumulated some of the ES4 designs that we'd done with Adobe for what we hoped would be the fourth edition of ECMAScript, that were supposed to fold in some of these old JavaScript 2 ideas that had come into ActionScript 3. So you look at the family tree and you see these forks, and the main ones are the ones that go into Adobe Flash, acquired from Macromedia, and the one that went into the server side of Microsoft's stack, which kind of died. And then trying to bring them back into the standard and not quite succeeding. ES4 was mothballed, but all the good parts that everyone liked made it into ES6. And so that was a success. And I said earlier I had the wrong year. I think it's 2015, so it's off by...
For ES6?
Yeah, it was finalized in 2015. It took a little longer than we hoped, but because ES5 was 2009, and that was a smaller increment from ES3. We skipped 4 again. We mothballed it. And we had a split in the committee where some people said, ES4 is too big. We're going to work on incremental improvements. No new syntax in particular, they promised. Not quite true, but they added a bunch of interesting APIs. Alan Weir-Sprock, my co-author of that Hopple paper, and he was at Microsoft at the time. I ended up hiring him at Mozilla. He wanted to get to Mozilla and keep doing the sort of editor job of the JavaScript standard, ECMAScript. And when we got ES6 done, it was a little late, 2015, and we switched to year numbers. So people still call it ES6. I call it ES6.
Yeah.
But if you remember, off by 9 plus 2000.